longer need we bow to outmoded models of the past. A new art is springing from its own environment, typically American. Mr. Wright is lifting the face of a nation, making its buildings reflect the soil and spirit of a great people, putting comfort, happiness, and beauty into their habitation.
Frank Lloyd Wright was once quoted as saying, "He didn't want to be known simply as the greatest architect that has ever lived, but as the greatest architect that ever will live." His personality was an intoxicating mix of arrogance and charm. But it was the genius of his work that spoke the loudest.
Frank Lloyd Wright was possibly the greatest artist in the world of architecture that America has ever produced. He profoundly changed the way we think about architecture. He created a whole architectural vocabulary that was his own and that has a more profoundly American quality than almost anything else.
But his genius was often overshadowed by scandal and tragedy. And for 30 years, he looked to his most trusted friend, greatest patron, and client, Darwin Martin, who supported him when no one else would.
Just that idea that he was there to help as a support for my grandfather, I think allowed my grandfather to keep going, and not to give up on the architecture. Darwin was there to support him.
This is the story of an unlikely friendship that played out in Buffalo, New York, a city that, at the beginning of the 20th century, was one of unbounded wealth and unparalleled architecture. It was here, over 100 years ago, that Wright designed an estate for Darwin Martin, a masterpiece he would call his opus. Presently, it's undergoing a restoration that will return it to its original condition, just as Wright designed it. And as new walls go up, the story of Darwin Martin and Frank Lloyd Wright unfolds, revealing a friendship that would have a deep and lasting effect on the architectural landscape of America. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Buffalo.
Major funding for Frank Lloyd Wright's Buffalo provided by the Margaret L. Wendt Foundation and the Zemsky Family Foundation, supporting the rich architectural heritage of Buffalo, Niagara. Additional funding is provided by the Buffalo News, where life unfolds daily, and the community's website, buffalo.com, Everything Buffalo. The Joya Family Fund, committed to the Buffalo Niagara region, its people, its culture, and its heritage. And by the Buffalo Niagara Convention and Visitors Bureau, proud to support Frank Lloyd Wright's Buffalo. Additional information is available at rightnowinbuffalo.com.
America in 1902 was proud and confident. The new century had arrived on a wave of industry lofted by a spirit of entrepreneurship. It was the age of the self-made man, industrious, visionary, and driven. One of those men was 35-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright. He was a singular individual with a personality that could both captivate and irritate. He was a spendthrift who could charm money from the pockets of the most astute businessman. And as an artist, innovator, and architect, he stood alone. His work rejected convention. It was bold, daring, and outspoken, a clean break from the typical Victorian style that America had come to know.
Wright created a whole new way of making architecture. It was committed to openness, to moving horizontally across the land. It was profoundly American. It was committed to technology, to the machine age, to really what was believed by a lot of people to be a whole new age that was dawning with the beginning of the 20th century.
Wright was born in 1867. It's said that his mother described his birth as prophetic. She believed beyond a doubt that her son was destined to become an architect, and instilled in him a sense of unbridled self-confidence. But his childhood was chaotic. The family drifted from town to town before finally putting down roots in their ancestral home in the Wisconsin Valley. And his weak but artistic father and strong-willed and pragmatic mother were always at odds. They finally divorced when Wright was a teenager. The experience had a powerful and lasting influence on the young boy.
Because he came from such an unhappy background, he really got the idea that he wanted to build the perfect home. I'm almost certain he had the theory that the perfect home would bring about the perfect marriage. And if you had an architect who thought about the relationship between people in their house, who thought about what it meant to have a hearth, who thought about the ritualistic aspects of dining, if all of those conditions could be met, they were going to be happy where they were.
Frank Lloyd Wright began his career at barely 20, with less than a year of architectural training under his belt. He'd moved from his home in rural Wisconsin to Chicago, a city that in 1887 was an architect's dream.
The issue is absolutely clear that Chicago was the perfect city to go to when Frank Lloyd Wright went there. It had been developing as the center of American business since the railroad went through. It had displaced St. Louis as the main place of transshipment in America. And Chicago had developed into the major city for building in this country.
Wright found his way to the office of Louis Sullivan, one of Chicago's leading architects, who had cemented his fame as the father of the modern skyscraper.
I'm sure every architect from here to Christmas was going to Chicago looking for work. And Frank, it was just Frank's incredible good fortune, of course, to hitch up with Louis Sullivan. I mean, what a plum job, you know. He must have shown extraordinary promise even at that young an age, I'm sure.
Wright was Sullivan's chief draftsman for 6 years. During that time, he persuaded Sullivan to loan him the money to build a fashionable house in the stylish Chicago suburb of Oak Park. But a draftsman's wage didn't match his voracious appetite for the good things in life. So in 1893, he betrayed Sullivan and began to secretly design homes for wealthy clients. When Sullivan found out, he was furious and promptly fired him, something Wright always denied, claiming instead that he had quit. But he never lost a beat. He added on to his house and opened his own studio. It was here he developed what was to become his trademark, the Prairie Home.
I love the prairie by instinct as a great simplicity. I had an idea that the horizontal planes in buildings identify themselves with the ground. To know what to leave out and what to put in, just where and just how, that is to have been educated in knowledge of simplicity, toward ultimate freedom of expression. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Wright's homes began springing up throughout Oak Park and the Midwest. But in the world of architecture, recognition came with large-scale commissions. Commissions that went to men like Sullivan. No one was willing to take a chance on Wright. He'd have to look elsewhere for the opportunity. Buffalo, New York. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a place to be reckoned with. Situated on Lake Erie, it was the 8th largest city in America, a hub of transportation and a powerhouse of industry. But only 75 years earlier, it was nothing more than a frontier outpost. That all changed in 1825 when the Erie Canal that ran between Albany and Buffalo was opened.
The Erie Canal is what created Buffalo. Its position on the lakes as a frontier town was extremely limited until there was that east-west link that really cleared the way for that whole westward expansion that came later in the 1800s. For Buffalo, it marked the start of an era of prosperity.
By 1900, the burgeoning steel industry had taken root in the city, and soon Buffalo replaced Pittsburgh as the #1 producer of steel in America. And to the north were the Falls of Niagara, with enough power to run the turbines that would turn Buffalo into the City of Light during the 1901 Pan American Exposition. Buffalo catapulted into the 20th century, and the money streamed in.
A lot of money was flowing through Buffalo. It was a center of wealth and capitalism. It was a center where things were being done, and it was a center that was convinced that it could get things done. People who lived here dreamed dreams, envisioned visions, and then did them, built them.
Some of America's greatest architects were coming to work in Buffalo. Daniel Burnham was commissioned for the Ellicott Square building, once the largest office building in the nation. Henry Hobson Richardson designed the massive New York State Mental Hospital, the largest building he had ever done. And Louis Sullivan gave the city the Guarantee Building, a milestone for the modern skyscraper.
Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, would have thought of Buffalo as a place similar to Chicago, as a place where you could do something interesting. Wright is known for saying that the best kind of clients are the independent businessman, because they could see the inventiveness in his architecture. They could see beyond the convention and see something that was unusual with value. And I think he would have thought of Buffalo as a place where just that kind of entrepreneur existed.
That businessman was Darwin Martin. He was born the youngest of 5 children in 1865, just 2 years before Frank Lloyd Wright. And like Wright, he too had a troubled and chaotic childhood. At 6, his world was shattered when his mother died. He was separated from all but one of his siblings and endured an agonizing move from his home in central New York to the Nebraska prairie.
I had been homesick all the time. I stood on the tops of fence posts, and as there was no one in sight, I cried lustily. Darwin D. Martin.
He just had his family life destroyed almost overnight. There was a really strong impulse in all of the stuff that he did to somehow transcend the misery. Like, I deserve better than this, and I can do this, and he just kept pushing.
His struggles fueled his drive. At 12 years old, he'd moved from Nebraska to New York City, where he got a job with his brother selling soap door to door for the Larkin Soap Company. But it was his fiery ambition and uncanny command of math that was getting him noticed. John Larkin, the company president, brought him to his headquarters in Buffalo, New York, to work as an accountant. Martin seized his opportunity, and he worked compulsively, 361 days a year, with an almost manic obsession.
Even as a child, he wanted to do something and do it well. And to him, hours didn't make that much difference. He lived in a boarding house. He was misplaced from family, his own environment, and he had something there where he could excel.
Martin's mentor and father figure at the time was Elbert Hubbard. a gregarious charmer who was second in command at the Larkin Company. He fancied himself a writer, philosopher, and artist whose mantra was, "Art is not a thing, it is a way." And like Frank Lloyd Wright, he attacked life with a passion.
Hubbard was a lovely character. He bounced into the office in the morning, you know, whistling and singing, or let out an Indian war whoop. And Wright was the same. He's one of these people, in a sense, you'd like to work around him, because he'd always come in the morning and he's always happy and he's always ready to do something really wonderful with life, you know. And so you've got these two characters who are remarkably similar, remarkably optimistic, and who are doing wonderful things.
In 1893, Hubbard threw the corporate world aside and established the Roycroft, an arts and crafts community just outside Buffalo. His departure from the company hit Martin hard, but it left an opening, and Martin stepped right in. His shrewd business leadership helped the Larkin Company become one of the nation's largest catalog merchandisers, rivaling both Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. By 1902, the company looked to build a new and innovative office for their headquarters, a building that would serve them well into the future. Darwin Martin would lead the search for the architect. A colleague pointed him to Oak Park, Illinois, and to Frank Lloyd Wright. In Oak Park, Martin was captivated by Wright's radically artistic style and the powerful value that he placed on the symbolism of the home.
I think that grandfather became mesmerized by Frank Lloyd Wright, who would pick up a pencil and draw something so unique that nobody else would have done. He saw a promise of something very unique and very special to this country, to not only Buffalo, but to the country.
On a pewter gray day in November of 1902, Darwin Martin welcomed Frank Lloyd Wright to Buffalo, New York. It was a watershed meeting for Wright. From it, he was determined to land one of the most important contracts of his early career, the large-scale commission that he'd been waiting for, the Larkin Administration Building.
I think that one of the reasons why Buffalo was so significant to him was the fact that it offered him this opportunity to do the Larkin Building. Wright wanted to get into commercial work. I mean, all through his life, he tried.
But company president John Larkin was leery of Wright's radical designs. He thought Louis Sullivan, Wright's former employer, was a better choice. Wright was determined to convince him that he wasn't.
So here was Frank Lloyd Wright, who had somehow made everybody believe that he was responsible for a lot of buildings, which in fact he wasn't, of course. He might have done some drawings or something, but he put himself over very well and convinced people that he was a second Louis Sullivan, a younger version of Louis Sullivan.
Wright's stretch of the truth and Martin's unyielding support were enough to convince Larkin to take a gamble on the young architect, and construction of the administration building began in 1904. When it was finished, 2 years later, it rose from the industrial landscape with a raw character and brutal power never before seen in an American office building. Wright was making a statement, loud and clear, that he'd arrived.
We see nobility, grandeur, and monumentality for office workers, a radical idea, and we see a whole new form of modernist expression, monumental, solid, and remarkable.
It was the simplicity of it, the massing of the building. the open atrium courtyard letting the light through from the top, coming down into this great central workspace. And it just opened up and freed the whole atmosphere and environment in which people work.
What Wright did was take that idea of atrium space, a skylit space, ring that space with offices that were really open balconies to create, in a curious way, in a really very beautiful way, what he talked about as a family place for business. He talked about the Larkin family being there.
They were in a different world. They really were. Those great big glass doors at the entrance to the lobby would close behind them, and everything was different. It was always very quiet in there. All the smells and noise of Seneca Street, the factories, was gone. And there was a sense of tranquility, of peace and repose in that building that I always remembered it.
Wright had created a new environment for the American office worker, but it was dismissed by the critics. Russell Sturgis, the leading architecture critic of the day, proclaimed it an extremely ugly building, a monster of awkwardness.
He was hoping for a critical acclaim. He was hoping that they had the perception to understand what he was doing. And of course they didn't, unfortunately.
There may be some to question whether it is beautiful or not. There always will be the usual two opinions about that. But insofar as it is simple and true, it will live, a blessing to its occupants. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Darwin Martin had amassed a personal fortune between the Nebraska Prairie and Buffalo, New York. And in 1903, the same year that he commissioned Wright for the Larkin Building, he hired him to design an estate for his family. He asked for 2 houses, a greenhouse, and a barn. Wright translated that into a residence on such a grand scale that he would one day refer to it as his opus. And it all began with the construction of a home for Martin's sister and her husband. Martin's attempt to repair his fractured family.
I never ceased mourning our broken home. The sweetest song on earth is Home, Sweet Home. Darwin D. Martin.
I think there was a complex of ideas and drives for him. One was trying to bring the family together. Come live with me in Buffalo. And then Wright comes into his life, and I think part of the attraction was here's somebody who can make the ultimate house, the ultimate home.
I think that there's no question about it that Martin was absolutely charmed by this guy. They were very much in sync on first principles. And the first principles were your home would make your life happy.
Martin gave Wright 3 things the young architect had never been given before: a large lot to work on, a nearly unlimited budget, and complete freedom of design. Wright's estimate was $35,000, a figure often referred to, but generally ignored. Martin offered only gestures of resistance when the cost spiraled out of control.
He didn't say, erase it. He didn't say, I'm not building it. He simply, made his little statement of surprise or semi-rebellion, if you will, and then the project moved along.
Dear Mr. Wright, if you could adopt a few principles necessary to success in every business. First, build within the appropriation, or approximately. Not as in my case, way, way, way beyond. Yours very truly, Darwin D. Martin.
My dear DDM, I think I told you that you couldn't hope to get out on a residence proper for less than $35,000. You ought to spend $75,000 on it just to leave Buffalo something worth having. Yours as ever, Frank Lloyd Wright.
Scores of workers, subcontractors, and artisans labored on the site for 2.5 years, building an estate that rivaled anything Wright had yet done. When completed, it was a harmonious composition of 5 structures: Darwin's house, the home for his sister, a carriage house, and a conservatory. Connecting it all was a long walkway called a pergola.
Wright desired but didn't often get a client who could actually build at the scale to which he thought people should build. What he did here has a magnificent scale in terms of the number of buildings and the size of the construction, but also has a wonderful sense, which he always had, of the scale that's necessary for a kind of intimate family life that need to be created within the spaces. And I think the Darwin Martin house is one of the high points of his sort of driving ideas about the Prairie House.
This was a commission which allowed him to really express totally the space. The design of the tables and the chairs, the stained glass, the mosaics around the fireplace and so forth. All of that was his opportunity to show what a total creation of space can be when it's done in creative hands. It all comes together in beautiful harmony, just absolutely beautiful harmony.
Ironically, just a few years earlier, William Wicks, one of Buffalo's leading residential architects, had built his home across the street.
Wicks would have been quite conservative. He would have seen Wright's work as, I wouldn't say an abomination, but as very, very outside the pale of what he knew architecture to be. And if one tried to place oneself in 1905, 1906, when it was finished, I think that you would have difficulty coming to terms with it.
On November 6, 1905, Martin, his wife Isabel, and their 2 children moved into their new home. Building the house had been an expensive venture for Martin, costing him $175,000, 5 times the original estimate. And Wright had dictated every detail. He even went so far as to design a dress for Isabel. But his artistic hand was too heavy for her.
Dear Mother, it discourages me and gives me the blues. I am afraid that Wright is impractical. The plan does not show care and appreciation of the needs of a home. Isabel R. Martin.
Isabel was nearly blind, and for her, the house was simply too dark. Pleas for more light fell on deaf ears.
Wright, in his arrogance, which of course is the defining characteristic of his personality, he was designing architecture, and he didn't care whether the inhabitants were comfortable.
Wright was so committed to the way the sun would come in through the house that he couldn't conceive of the house in any other terms. And being asked to bring more light into the house was tantamount to saying, throw out your ideas, and he couldn't do that.
Primarily, nature furnished the materials for architectural motifs. Her wealth of suggestion is inexhaustible. Her riches greater than any man's desire. Frank Lloyd Wright.
The idea of connecting the human being to the natural environment was critical part of what a home had to be. To not only reinforce our relationship with other human beings, but also to ensure reconnecting us to our roots, the earth, if you will.
He wanted to make us feel that there was almost a continuum between the inside and the outside. That the sort of solid barrier between inside and outside was something left over from an older age.
You know, Wright's idea was to make you one with the landscape, with nature. And I think that house does that more thoroughly than any other.
The way the glass is designed is it allows you to look out onto the landscape. And it's really remarkable to me when you see the autumn leaves on the outside and then the colors of the stained glass. It's just like the leaves have come right on into the inside of the house. This is quite remarkable with the Martin house. It's done in many of the prairie houses, but here it's really done to the ultimate.
The other thing that happens in the Martin house is the wonderful relationship between spaces. There is a sense that there's both a room, but there's also rooms that connect to other rooms. And so you're in one room, you're in 3 rooms, you're in 1 room, you're in 5 rooms. But at the same time, the scale and the furnishings particularly bring a wonderful sense that you can have this intimacy within a space that, on the other hand, seems to sort of go on forever.
There is no doubt that the house is unique. The house is singular in many aspects. And one has a sense that Wright was giving Martin something special.
Martin's original request had been for 2 houses, a greenhouse, and a barn. It was transformed into a portrait of his success. Nothing embodied that more than a statue of the Greek goddess Nike, symbol of victory, that stood in the conservatory at the end of the pergola. It was the first thing Martin experienced when he entered the house.
All of your experiences were prefaced by this moment. Nike, victory. Was it his mother? Was it the triumph of his life and business? Whatever that story is, it's the most powerful narrative that Wright ever produced in a building.
One of the fascinating things about architecture is that it exists at this sort of exquisite moment of intersection where the awesome intersects with the everyday. And to make art out of that is the challenge of architecture.
By now, Darwin Martin and Frank Lloyd Wright had known each other for 7 years and had formed a strong bond of friendship, one that would carry Wright through his most difficult times to come. In 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright appeared to have it all: a wife and family in Oak Park, and a career that was getting him noticed. Wright was not content. Without a backward glance, he decided to leave his wife Catherine and their 6 children for the wife of a former client, Mamah Borthwick Cheney. In one impulsive decision, he tossed away a career and reputation that he'd spent years trying to build. And home, the greatest symbol in his life, was dismantled brick by his own hand.
He said at one point, "I've gone through rivers of tears and blood to get to what home symbolized for me, which was peace and calm and a happy life. But the implication was that even though he had struggled so hard, it still eluded him. You can't look for peace of mind outside yourself. You know, only you can give that to yourself. I don't think he knew that.
My dear DDM, in my own life there is much that is complex, at least. Life is not the simple thing it should be if within myself I could find the harmony that you have found. Yours as ever, Frank Lloyd Wright.
Wright and Mamah Cheney ran off to Europe. He wrote to Martin that he was leaving the office to its own devices. I think of you often as real friends. I wish you might think the same of me. When he returned to Oak Park a year later, his wife Catherine refused to give him a divorce. He was vilified in the press and found himself deserted by friends and clients alike. Old friends, he wrote to Darwin, cross the road to avoid me.
Do not concern yourself about the people who set their tongues to talking. They count for nothing as friends or otherwise. The people who will do you service are not talking. Your friend, Darwin D. Martin.
Just that idea that he was there to help as a support for my grandfather, I think allowed my grandfather to keep going, and not to give up on the architecture, even though the commissions weren't there. And yet Darwin was there to support him.
With his personal and financial life in shambles, Wright looked to what he called the fine nature and good heart of Darwin Martin. And Martin came through. He loaned him money to pay off past debts, assumed the mortgage on his mother's house, and advanced him $25,000.
My dear Mr. Wright, what you term a fine nature and a good heart is commonly termed succor or angel. Yours very truly, Darwin D. Martin.
Wright was hounded by his own indiscretions. He decided to leave Oak Park and return to the Wisconsin Valley where he was raised. He convinced Martin to loan him money to build a small house. He claimed it was for his mother. In reality, it was a magnificent home and studio to share with his lover, Mamah Cheney. He named it Taliesin. It means shining brow and comes from a Welsh myth of transformation and rebirth.
I think it was very difficult, both for him and Mrs. Cheney. They had to have a place of security, a place where they could retreat to. And of course, Catherine would not divorce him. So, in a sense, to society, he and Mrs. Cheney were living in sin. And the times are very different then than they are now.
But on August 14th, 1914, while Wright was away in Chicago, the unthinkable happened. A disgruntled servant set fire to Taliesin and brutally murdered Mamah Cheney, her 2 children, and 4 servants.
Julian Carlton serves lunch very quietly, and then he goes around the outside of the house, spreading gasoline all over the ground, and then he sets a light to the gasoline and he comes in with a hatchet. The first person he kills is Mamah Cheney, and then he kills her children as well. 7 people die.
Wright buried Mamah in the family plot within sight of Taliesin. A tree marked her grave. The reason behind the murders never came to light.
My dear DDM, Of course, you may imagine I haven't cared much whether things went on or not for some months past. I've been hard hit. How hard, God alone knows. But that is no concern of yours as a creditor. Although it might be as a friend. Sincerely, Frank Lloyd Wright.
Wright wrote that he could see only forward. He could not see backward because the pain was too great. He took refuge in the idea that Taliesin should live to show something more for its mortal sacrifices than a charred ruin. In action, there is release. He would rebuild with the help of Darwin Martin.
And what would Martin say? He couldn't say no, really, could he? I mean, everybody had felt enormous sympathy for Frank after this. It was just terrible.
In 1916, Wright accepted a commission in Japan for the Imperial Hotel. He needed both the work and the time away.
He really was, in a way, almost sort of fortunate to run off to Tokyo from 1916 to 1922 to work on the Imperial Hotel. He thought that was going to take care of everything, all the money problems that he had had. But it got him out of the public eye.
But Japan hadn't been the cure-all that Wright had hoped for. After his return, he was no better off, personally or financially, than when he had left. Once again, he turned to Darwin Martin.
Dear Mr. Wright, your letter of the 20th is at hand. I am enclosing a check for $2,500. Dear Mr. Wright, the loan was upon 4 $1,000 notes
Dear
dated
sir,
May. I have already loaned you more than I think you can afford to borrow. More than I dare think your business management will enable you to take care of. I am enclosing a check for $3,500. Squeeze through with it, if you can.
Then, in 1925, Wright had an offer for Darwin Martin.
My dear Darwin D. Martin, why not become my business partner? I need just such a man as you. Our financial relations have been so felicitous, I should think you would look upon the proposition with great joy. My love to all, Frank Lloyd Wright.
Dear Mr. Wright, your invitation to join up with you I know is sincere, and I appreciate the compliment. But I seek quietude and obscurity, and you could offer neither. Cordially yours, Darwin D. Martin.
Martin had just retired after 47 years with the Larkin Company. He had started at $4 a week and was now worth millions, and was ready to build a summer home for his retirement years with Isabel and his family. He turned to Frank Lloyd Wright. For Wright, it couldn't have come at a better time.
1927. The load of debt has mounted. The next move, even the next meal, is becoming a problem to be solved somehow without money. There's less than none. I'm hungry for work, not honors. Frank Lloyd Wright.
I think it was, first of all, a vote of confidence by Darwin Martin in him. This was a way of allowing him to financially go on and to go on as an architect, to have something to do, to be able to create.
The 60-year-old Wright was nearly destitute and living back at Taliesin with a 27-year-old lover, a woman he would soon marry. He jumped at his old friend's offer. But this time, Darwin made it clear that Isabel was the client.
Dear Mr. Wright, if a house is built, it is only for her pleasure. Everything must be done to meet her views thereon. Sincerely, Darwin D. Martin.
Wright reluctantly obliged.
Dear Mother, I find that I am taking almost more pleasure in building this house than our home. It is so much less elaborate. In fact, nothing could be plainer. Isabel R. Martin.
The home was called Graycliff, just outside Buffalo on the shore of Lake Erie. For Isabel, it was an antidote to the darkness of the Martin estate that she had been living with for the past 20 years.
It appealed to Isabel clearly in its simplicity. It was much lighter because he eliminated the broad overhangs and the stained glass, art glass windows, the things that gave the city house its sense of privacy and safety, if you will, and shelter. Those very things were eliminated because of the nature of the site and its privacy.
It was just wonderful. There were the birds and there were the fresh breezes and flowers everywhere. She loved it out here. Up here she sparkled.
The stock market crash devastated the Martin fortune. They slipped slowly into financial darkness. By 1932, the money was nearly gone. Just a few years earlier, Martin had helped edit Wright's autobiography. And now, as the book neared publication, he couldn't even afford to buy a copy.
Dear Mr. Wright, I had notice from a Chicago bookseller that your autobiography would be ready March 30th for $6. But alas, I am paying nothing but lunches and car fares. Everything else goes for taxes and interest. Sincerely yours, Darwin D. Martin.
Dear DDM, I get 6 copies only from the publisher, but DDM shall have one, if no one else. Faithfully, Frank Lloyd Wright.
At the time, Wright owed Martin nearly $70,000, money that was never repaid. Martin suffered a series of strokes and died in 1935 at the age of 70. Near penniless, he was buried in an unmarked grave. Frank Lloyd Wright wrote to a client, "My best friend and most helpful one died." Isabel lived in the Martin house until she could no longer afford the upkeep. She walked out without even bothering to lock the door.
There was no looking back, because that was a chapter in her life that she could not recoup, and the Martin house could not be sustained. No one wanted to buy it. This was approaching World War II, and eventually they had to let it go to back taxes. It was never visited again.
The Martin estate was eventually purchased after sitting abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Frank Lloyd Wright wrote to the new owner, "Please, take care of the opus." But by 1960, the new owners demolished much of the complex, leaving behind the Martin house and the home that Darwin had built for his sister. And Buffalo, too, had begun a free fall from its perch of distinction among the leading cities of the early 20th century. By the mid-1980s, the steel mills had gone cold. Cargo ships carried only memories of a bygone era. And the Martin house, once again empty, began to crumble. Even the magnificent Larkin Administration Building, the reason behind Wright's journey to Buffalo, had fallen to the wrecking ball when the company itself faltered.
I think the architecture of Buffalo now, the legacy of people like Richardson and Sullivan and Wright, is very key to its future. And it's important for the people who live here full-time and drive past those buildings and glance up at them on their way for a coffee or whatever. Because, first of all, it's a reminder of what this city could do in the past. And it's the seed of imagination for what the city can do in the future.
The Wright legacy runs deep in Buffalo. 3 other Frank Lloyd Wright houses exist in the city, a direct result of Darwin Martin and his undying belief in the architect. And at the heart of that legacy is the Darwin Martin Estate. It's being completely restored, and all of the structures that had been demolished are being meticulously rebuilt according to Wright's original plan.
I think that the restoration of the Martin House complex will be extremely important. It's one of those buildings that has really entranced, created fantasies in people's minds about what it was like. With the Martin House, it's something that was really gone. And all we had was some photographs. Being able to experience things like that view down the pergola will be just mind-boggling.
People will again be able to see Wright creating not just individual building, but this entire compound, this entire complex, the relationship of the house to the land that was so important to him. It will make this house one of the very few Wright houses in which you can really perceive the original context in which the architect designed the house. That'll make it very important around the world, not just in Buffalo.
The years following Darwin Martin's death were good to Frank Lloyd Wright. He would enjoy some of the most prolific years of his career and design such masterworks as Falling Water in Pennsylvania and the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. In 1931, Wright had sent a letter to Martin. In it, he said, "I believe my best work is yet ahead of me." Martin replied,
"Dear Mr. Wright, Mrs. Martin and I have no doubt of your ability to rise to the eminence commercially to which you have attained artistically. With that accomplished, we shall, in time, have nothing to regret and no losses to count. Sincerely, Darwin D. Martin."
Sir Edwin Lutyens said, "There will never be great architects or architecture without great patrons." It may be no coincidence then that Wright, while at a public retrospective of his work in 1953, chose to sit and reflect on his 70-year career in front of a picture of the Larkin Building.
My dear DDM, I appreciate most of all the time you took from a busy life to consider me and my muddle, and the fine spirit of helpfulness you contribute to an unpopular cause. I think you are a better friend than I. As always, Frank Lloyd Wright.
Major funding for Frank Lloyd Wright's Buffalo provided by the Margaret L. Wendt Foundation and the Zemsky Family Foundation, supporting the rich architectural heritage of Buffalo, Niagara. Additional funding is provided by the Buffalo News, where life unfolds daily, and the community's website, buffalo.com, everything Buffalo. The Joya Family Fund, committed to the Buffalo Niagara region, its people, its culture, and its heritage. And by the Buffalo Niagara Convention and Visitors Bureau, proud to support Frank Lloyd Wright's Buffalo. Additional information is available at rightnowinbuffalo.com.
We are PBS.